So, how does a modern, educated democracy just fall apart and end up with a dictator? Well, it's not like a switch flips overnight. It's actually a series of steps, some really bad miscalculations, and a whole lot of crisis that eats away at the system from the inside. And that's what we're going to unpack right here. The step-by-step story of how the Nazi Party managed to legally take over Germany.
Okay, to really get this, you have to start with the crisis. I mean, just look at this number. By 1932, we're talking about 35 to 40% unemployment in Germany. That's almost half the workforce. This wasn't just a bad recession, It was a full-blown national catastrophe. Businesses were shutting down, banks were failing, people were absolutely desperate. This single statistic, it's the fuel for everything that's about to happen.
So, yeah, this is the big question, isn't it? How did a nation that was suffering so much, economically, and still kind of reeling from a lost war, look at all this chaos and decide that the answer was a radical extremist party? To figure that out, we've got to go back just a little bit further.
The seeds of the Third Reich were really planted in the soil of World War I. The end of that war left Germany in this state of profound shock and humiliation, and that created the perfect environment for a new and very dangerous voice to rise up.
Just try to imagine it. Your country loses 2 million people. Your life savings are completely wiped out by hyperinflation, and you're left with this deep sense of betrayal, like you've lost all your national pride. That was Germany in the early 1920s. And out of all that desperation, a failed artist and war veteran named Adolf Hitler found his political calling, blaming Germany's defeat on so-called enemies at home.
Now, what's so crucial to understand is that Hitler's first shot at seizing power, the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923, was complete and utter failure. He tried a violent coup, and it landed him in prison. But in that failure, he learned something absolutely vital. The real path to power wasn't through force, it was by working the democratic system itself.
For a few years there in the late 1920s, it almost seemed like Germany might actually pull through. Things were starting to stabilize. But then, an event all the way on the other side of the world sent the country into a complete freefall. And that gave the Nazis the exact opening they've been waiting for.
This timeline just lays it all out so clearly, doesn't it? You can see how fragile Germany's recovery really was. It was all built on these short-term American loans. So when Wall Street crashed in 29, U.S. banks basically said, we need our money back now. They pulled the rug out from under the entire German economy and boom, it collapsed almost overnight.
And wow, just look at this chart. The connection between that economic crisis and the Nazis' rise is impossible to ignore. I mean, in 1928, when things were kind of looking up, they were just this tiny fringe party, only 12 seats. Fast forward to 1932, right in the middle of the Depression, they explode to 230 seats, making them the biggest party in parliament. The link is just staggering, right?
So why on earth did people vote for them? Well, the existing government seemed completely paralyzed, and in that atmosphere of total crisis, the Nazis came along and presented themselves as the only party that was youthful, energetic, and actually had a plan. They weren't just a party. They branded themselves as the Hitler movement, a force that could save the nation.
Okay, so they had the popular support, but how did that turn into actual control? Well, this next part of the story is all about how the Nazis didn't overthrow the system. They used its own rules, its own laws, and its own weaknesses to grab absolute power, all perfectly legally.
Their whole strategy was basically to be everything to everyone. If you actually look at their platform, it was incredibly vague. They weren't offering detailed economic policies. Nope. They were selling a feeling. We'll make Germany great again. We'll get you jobs. We'll restore your pride. They just made these big, emotional promises that were designed to appeal to a population that was desperate and totally fractured.
And right here, this is the moment, the fatal miscalculation. You see, the conservative elite, the old guard of German politics, they thought they were being so clever. They figured, hey, let's make this Hitler guy chancellor. We'll put him in a little box, use his popularity for our own agenda, and we'll be the ones pulling the strings. They honestly believed they could control him. And they were just catastrophically wrong.
The second Hitler had his foot in the door as chancellor, he did not waste a single second. What came next was this lightning-fast, absolutely ruthless campaign to tear down every democratic institution and crush any and all opposition, both outside and inside his own party. It took less than a month. Think about that. First, the Reichstag building catches fire, creating this huge national emergency. They immediately blame the communists, and Hitler uses that panic to convince President Hindenburg to sign a decree that suspends basic rights like freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Then, using a ton of intimidation, he shoves the Enabling Act through Parliament, which basically makes him a legal dictator.
So after getting rid of his opponents outside the party, Hitler turned inward. The Night of the Long Knives was this incredibly brutal purge of his own stormtroopers, the SA, and their leader, Ernst Röhm, who he started to see as a rival. The message was terrifyingly clear. Nobody was safe. He would eliminate anyone who stood in his way.
And these weren't just abstract political moves. This quote from Fritz Lustig, who was just a schoolboy in Berlin at the time, really shows how suddenly and completely life changed. Can you imagine looking out your school window and seeing the streets just filled with torchlit marches? The takeover wasn't happening behind closed doors. It was a huge public spectacle.
So with total control locked down, the regime started to operate on two different levels. It put on this carefully polished, modern face for the rest of the world to see, while at the same time unleashing just unimaginable terror and persecution against its enemies at home.
And this slide just perfectly illustrates that two-faced strategy. On one hand, you've got the 1936 Olympics, where the Nazis put on this big show for the world, pretending to be a peaceful, modern nation. They even took down their anti-Semitic posters for a little while. But then, just 2 years later, you get Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, a violent, state-sponsored attack against Jewish citizens. It's just a shocking contrast.
Their control was total. They made a cheap people's radio just so they could pump propaganda directly into 70% of German homes. They controlled all the newspapers, all the films, and get this, every single club in Germany, from singing groups to chess clubs, was forced to become part of the Nazi machine. There was just no escaping the party's influence.
And here's Fritz Lustig again, grounding this all in a stark human reality. This is what it was actually like to live through this. You just go to work the day after Kristallnacht, and your boss and his sons are gone. Just like that, arrested and sent to concentration camps. The terror was immediate, and it was personal.
Hitler then solidified his popularity with a string of foreign policy wins that, and this is key, didn't cost any German lives. By taking back territory and annexing Austria, he restored that national pride that was shattered after World War I. To a lot of Germans, it looked like he was delivering on his promise to make Germany strong again, all while he was hiding his ultimate goal, a catastrophic war.
And that kind of brings us to our final thought, doesn't it? The story of how the Nazis took power, it's not just some dusty old history lesson. It's a really powerful warning. It shows you how that perfect storm of economic crisis, national humiliation, a few terrible political gambles, and some really clever propaganda can just tear apart a democracy from the inside. Which really leaves us with a big question to think about. What are the warning signs we should all be looking for today?